afternoon's fireside chat, even though we don't quite have a fire behind us. But I want to start by introducing someone who in this audience truly needs no introduction. Harold Hongju Ko is one of the most important and most honorable voices in the field of international law today. He is, of course, the Sterling Professor of International Law at Yale Law School, where he served as the Dean of the Law School from 2004 to 2009, I believe. Harold has also spent much of his career in government, serving first as the Assistant Secretary of State for Democracy, Rights, and Labor under Bill Clinton, then as legal advisor at the State Department under Secretary Clinton when we shared a corner of the 7th floor together, and most recently as a senior political appointee in the legal advisor's office in the first years of the Biden administration. Harold has also argued some of the most important cases in international law of our generation. One of the moments where my spine still tingles was sitting about 2 seats behind you when you argued the Ukraine-Russia case at the ICJ. As many of you know, Harold wrote a book some 7 years ago now called The Trump Administration in International Law. And I know that Harold is actually in the process of revising and updating that book. So much of our conversation today will be about what those edits, revisions, and new chapters need to be. But if you're waiting for that, you should also see his new book from this past year, The National Security Constitution in the 21st Century, which is a really important read, both in relation to our topic today and more broadly. But today we'll be talking about the Trump administration in international law. And we envision this as both a fireside chat and a conversation with the broader community. But we're going to do the conversation part a little differently to allow people to submit questions anonymously by using the ACIL app. So if you would like to ask a question, the app is open. Go to your CVent app and click on this panel. At the bottom of the screen, you will see a special button that says Submit Questions Here. And you may submit those questions without any fear of your name having to be attached to them or otherwise. So I encourage you to do that. The app is open, and about halfway through, we'll switch to questions from the app. If you see me looking at my phone, it is not because I'm online shopping. It is because that's how I will get your questions and send them to Harold. But Harold, I'm envisioning our conversation today in sort of 4 broad categories. I want to start by thinking about what's new, particularly from what you wrote 7 years ago. And then I want to pivot a little bit and talk about our allies and how they see America's role in the world today and the future of international law. And then I want to talk about resistance and resilience of institutions, courts, and societies like our own. And then if we have time, we can talk about some specific areas of international law that are under strain, but that may end up coming from the audience. So my first question, I suppose, is pretty obvious, Harold. What did you get wrong 7 years ago, or at least what's new today?
What I said 7 years ago was that Trump was not winning, but it was because he is not bigger than international law, and that his success in carrying out a strategy of destruction should be resisted by all of the different institutions who support the rule of law in international affairs to band together in various ways. And I think they largely did. And we survived. This time, though, it's different in a couple of respects. First, he's better organized. We have a Project 2025. Second, he's more warlike in his threats. This time around, he's talking about territorial ambitions in places like Greenland, Panama Canal, Mexico, in Canada as a 51st state, Gaza as a place where U.S. troops could be committed. It's more blatantly self-serving in terms of business opportunities. How many people view the destruction of Gaza as an opportunity to build a resort hotel on the Middle East? This is sort of an Atlantic City solution to what has been a grotesque human tragedy. This time there's more payback because last time people resisted, and so they figure out the message that they should be more determined to break the institutional counterweights and break their spirit at the very beginning. And a lot of what we're seeing in the war against law firms, the war against universities, the war against the press, the war against alliances, and a campaign against immigration is all designed to encourage various forms of anticipatory capitulation, self-exit, and self-silencing. So the answer to that is simply don't do it. Don't do it. If the American Society of International Law is not speaking up for the rule of law in international affairs, then why does it exist?
So, Harold, the international legal system is really built on much of the post-World War II international order. And it is under threat from lots of directions at the moment. You've just talked about the internal threat that the United States, the country that for the longest time was the backbone of that order. But I'm wondering, as you look at the various threats the international order today is facing, which are the most pressing? Which are the most enduring? Which are you worried most about?
Well, what's most enduring as a threat is a loss of confidence in U.S. leadership and commitment to these values. Not just because every 4 years we could flip back and forth to being a defender of this system that we helped to build into a destroyer of the system, but also because of the rise of authoritarianism worldwide. So we have been living in a Kantian system of global governance. It's not perfect, but it's essentially part of the end of World War II and the creation of the Bretton Woods system in economic affairs. And what we're seeing is a systematic effort to destroy the economic and political alliances by the country that made it. And so what it could end up doing is leading to the collapse of this Kantian system and its replacement with a 1984 system of spheres of influence in which there is no truth, alliances change day to day, autocrats dicker with one another, and human rights and rule of law are not significant values, much less democracy. So I think that this is not something that was accomplished by Trump in the first 4 years, but it could well be a byproduct. Finally, and I think this is the most important, someone came to me just now and said, "What do you think is going to happen?" And the answer is, this is not a scientific moment. This is a moment of collective energy and fighting. If someone gives you a diagnosis, you have cancer, will I live or die? Whether you live or die turns on many, many factors. But most important, whether you fight, and whether you fight with skilled practitioners who are using every single piece of ingenuity to try to bring about a positive result. And the result is not certain, but what is certain is if you don't fight, you won't survive.
That's a lesson we and so many institutions need to, of course, bear in mind and hold in our heart at the moment. But one of the things that I think I struggle with, and I know many of my students who are sitting in the audience struggle with, is feeling a little overwhelmed at the moment. You've just listed a litany of sort of challenges that the order is facing. And I guess I'm wondering if you can maybe help distill what are the flashpoints you're most worried about? What are the ones you think we need to keep our eye on? Oftentimes it feels like there's a lot of fireworks going on, maybe to keep us distracted from the ones that are most important. And as you look out at the international legal system and institutional order today, where are your greatest concerns, or which are the flashpoints that you want us to keep our eyes on?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that, Bill. We need an attitude and we need an approach. Not to shamelessly name drop, but I will. I met Nelson Mandela one day for 30 seconds. And it was at the UN Security Council. He was president of South Africa. And he came in to address the Security Council, and Richard Holbrooke, who is our ambassador, says to him, Mr. President, you were imprisoned on Robben Island for 26 years. How did you survive? And Mandela said, I missed that time. I got a lot of reading done. And in that moment, you knew how he survived. He just didn't get overwhelmed. He didn't get discouraged. He had a positive attitude toward what was otherwise a very bleak situation. The approach I call this Mandela and the Martian. There's a movie with Matt Damon, spoiler alert, it involves a astronaut who's stranded in Mars. At the end of the movie, he's asked, do you think you were finished? And he said, every day, every second. And he goes, but you just solve one problem, and you solve the next problem, you solve the next problem, you solve the next problem. And if we solve enough problems, we get to have a different president. And that ought to be our approach. So as these things come, you have to gear up, find some allies, and fight these issues out. Now, let me make a very simple point. Trump does not have a foreign policy. He has a sanctions policy. It's an ad hoc sanctions policy, primarily in service of a claim of homeland security, which he says is based on immigration threats, which has subordinated national security. Stephen Miller and his team are running Homeland Security, and the National Security Council has been reduced in response. And his hope is to use the claim of national security to justify virtually everything he's doing. Including, for example, saying Canada is a national security threat. Justin Trudeau said, why did you say that? And Trump said, because you burned the White House in the War of 1812, and you could look this up. Trump said that, and Trudeau said, actually, that wasn't us, that was the Brits. But it doesn't matter. That's a basis for imposing tariffs. And what it does is it alienates our best friends. So what is the threat that I'm most worried about? It is the attack on preparedness. Let's just take some examples. He wants to eliminate FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency. So what are we going to do when the next hurricane comes? He wants to withdraw from the World Health Organization. What do we do when the next global pandemic comes? He wants to withdraw from the climate agreement. What do we do when all of the turmoil around that come? He wants people to be misinformed and underinformed by appointing people like Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and Tulsi Gabbard. So when measles break out, we have a Secretary of Health and Human Services who's recommending that people take cod liver oil. He wants to purge the civil service of the most knowledgeable people who could actually counter this misinformation. And then he wants to alienate the allies we need to launch a cooperative and collective assault on global problems that are too big enough for us to address. Now, people don't really notice this loss of preparedness. When you go out without your jacket, it's too late. You're already cold. This attack on, quote, government efficiency by firing all these people who possess the most deep knowledge of the recurring problems for administration after administration may unify power in the hands of those politicos who are loyal to Trump. But it does nothing to enhance our preparedness to deal with the next set of threats.
Harold, earlier in your answer, you talked a little bit about Trump not really having a foreign policy. And I want to give the Trump administration the benefit of the doubt for a moment and sort of say, is there any kind of unifying principle or themes maybe we saw in the first administration, we're seeing again, that we don't have to agree with, but at least we have to understand? You said it's national security. Maybe it's, the National Security Constitution is the book we need to read to understand it. But is there any kind of kernel of unifying foreign policy theory that informs the myriad of sort of chaos that we're seeing?
Well, it's captured by America first, which is American autarky in a global and interdependent world. So, there's, the idea that having built a system of tariffs and tariff reductions through the WTO system, multiple rounds of reduction of tariff and non-tariff barriers, and multilateral commitments to forswear tariffs as a tool of trade policy. We're suddenly engaged in economic warfare against most of the countries of the world, including our closest allies. So there is more of a method than there is a strategic goal. The method is threats with expectation of negotiated surrender. But the truth is, this time around, they're ready. And, so he said, I'm going to solve Ukraine in 24 hours. Well, it's not getting solved in 24 hours. It turns out the Europeans and the Ukrainians think that they might have some stake in this too. And they're weighing in on that. In all of the different areas, on all the tariffs, people said, okay, we'll impose huge counter tariffs. And then suddenly he had to put a pause on. Now, if there's another strain of this, is how these pauses are put on end up benefiting certain supporters economically. And that may be the real rationale here, which is getting various kinds of rent-seeking accomplished while you have possession of the power of the White House. Presidents are not supposed to come away from their presidencies personally enriched, but that's certainly a goal here.
Harold, you actually pivoted us exactly in the direction I wanted to go, which was to talk a little bit about our allies and the response of our allies. And in your books, you talk about the decline of U.S. leadership and trust in U.S. leadership over time. But we're now in a whole new world where we are attacking treaty allies, where we're threatening treaty allies with territorial annexation. And I guess I'm wondering, how you see our allies responding. And you were suggesting that they're now able to mount a pretty robust policy response to it. The German foreign minister just last month says, quote, Europe cannot afford to remain dependent on a partner that openly disrespects the rules of the game. And I'm wondering if you can maybe take us inside a little bit more how our allies are seeing this and what that shift means for their ability to protect a system even while we may be trying to tear it down.
Yeah, I think you see it across the board. You see it with Mark Carney's statements in response to the threat of tariffs. You see it in Keir Starmer and Macron's meetings with Trump in the Oval Office. All of which are to say, the Germans responding to the Ukraine threats, which is this time we're ready. So, for example, NATO shifted the Ukraine command and to a different set of units within NATO, so they could be more insulated from various kinds of unilateral threats coming from the United States. And so what we're seeing, and is a very good example, was, and I mentioned this at the Ukraine panel the other day, people in the American society were horrified on the third anniversary of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine because the United States voted against the notion that Russia was committing aggression. Zelensky was bullied in the White House by the president and the vice president. And then the next day, Hegseth, the Secretary of Defense, threatened to withhold aid, to withhold cyber support, and to withhold intelligence sharing, which is basically a way of harming the offensive capabilities of the Ukrainian military. But the very next day, President Zelensky went to Europe, where instead of the plan that Trump was proposing, which is peace without conditions, the Europeans came forward with a plan for a durable peace with conditions, which included security guarantees, a chain of events running from ceasefire to truce to deployment of a peacekeeping force to civilian reconstruction and accountability, committed money for that purpose and have now essentially been running a robust set of negotiations while Trump's negotiations led by Witkoff are basically coming to an end because it turns out that the Russians aren't really serious. And what's going to happen will be that the Trump people will come back and say, you know, we have a commitment to some sort of ceasefire by the Russians based on certain security guarantees, and the Europeans and the Ukrainians won't accept it, and they'll say, no, we want peace with guarantees. And there, I think the three key commitments are nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine at the table, that Ukraine should be put on its path to NATO membership. That should not be sold away in the negotiations. And third, that the frozen Russian assets and the sanctions should not be lifted until there's a reconstruction plan, a compensation scheme, and a commitment to no peace without justice, which is what happened in Bosnia. And I think what we're going to see happen is that Trump, who has essentially no real commitment to substance here, will say, well, what I wanted, which is peace, is working. And he will gradually let his plan or non-plan get folded into the plan that's led by the Europeans.
I appreciate that. For those who weren't here on Wednesday, you were on a fantastic panel on Ukraine, and it's nice to hear you lay it out that clearly. I want to talk to you about the U.S.'s new transactional approach with our allies, and whether it's Ukraine will maybe help you in those negotiations if you give us your rare earths, or Japan and South Korea maybe will continue troop deployments if you give us trade benefits, or with all of our allies now, it feels much more like a mercantilist vision of international law. International law, of course, that can be part of what international law is about, but how is that transactional approach playing with our allies, and what damage is it doing to the institutional order as a whole?
Well, they don't share that vision. Did you ever hear the Biden administration mention a minerals deal? When I was called by a journalist who asked me, what do you think of the minerals deal? I said, doesn't sound like the Marshall Plan to me. There is an approach that those interested in preserving and rebuilding a global order play. Look at the countries that were destroyed in World War II and the robust role that they play now because of a multilateral alliance for reconstruction and development. And it wasn't all about gaining access to chips for cell phones or other kinds of crude business arrangements. In the same way as I think Mark Carney put it well. He said that too often people with a business background seek opportunity in tragedy, when we should be creating much broader opportunities that look back to correcting historic wrongs. Mm-hmm. I mean, how can you think about Gaza, the leveled Gaza, as a place where on the destroyed fabric of people of color who have been involuntarily displaced and subject to massive human rights abuse, that's an occasion to set up a casino. That's the kind of, by the way, that was not dissimilar to what was done in Atlantic City, just ignoring the past and not attempting to address the historic issues. Where will the Gazans go? Who will take them in? Will Egypt be enlisted? And a backdrop to all of the end of the Biden term negotiations was Secretary Blinken's effort to forge a multilateral process in the Mideast, where the more moderate Arab states would be working with an alternative, Palestinian alternative to Hamas, for a longer-term stable arrangement that would both give security guarantees to the Israelis, but also find a homeland for the Palestinians after all of these years. And for all we know, this is all in a shambles. Steve Witkoff, who is nominally the Israeli or Middle East negotiator, is spending all of his time in Ukraine, who is Steve Witkoff? He's a real estate developer. So not surprisingly, he's thinking in these mercantilist terms.
So I'm going to pivot to the last area of our conversation before I open to the floor for questions. If you do want to ask a question, go to the CVent app. You must add this session to your program. There's a button that says Add Session. Click on that, and then when you open the session, that question box will appear, and we'll start taking those. But before I do that, Harold, I want to talk about resistance and resilience. With remarkable speed, the U.S. federal judiciary has stepped into an important role in that resistance. And I'm wondering if you can share your thoughts about whether the courts will be able to hold the line, and particularly in areas related to international law, where traditionally the executive has relatively wide discretion. Can we look to the U.S. judiciary as a way of ensuring the rule of law and the future of U.S. commitment to international law?
Well, a major moment of truth is coming. The Supreme Court granted cert in the birthright citizenship cases. They're going to hear those in May. You've got the cases involving the Venezuelan planes, the planes of Venezuelans that were took off against Judge Boasberg's order. You have the case of Kilmar Abrego Garcia, where the judge, two cases where the federal courts have openly threatened to hold the president in contempt. Steve Vladeck of Georgetown had a tweet not long ago, 46 court decisions, so now it's up to 55 or something like that, from judges appointed by 5 different presidents blocking the court's order. And he says, well, maybe the problem is not the courts, and a good way to put it. But it will turn now on whether the Supreme Court is ready to send the kind of message that was sent yesterday by Judge J. Harvey Wilkinson of the Fourth Circuit, which is Marbury versus Madison means something. It's the province and duty of the Judicial Department to say what the law is. Now, there are 2 barriers. One is justiciability. John Roberts has actually been pretty strong on favoring justiciability, even in foreign affairs cases. But the more dangerous, which I outline in my new book, is theories which I call Youngstown Category 3, which is that the president claims a plenary power and that therefore he can trump the power of the alternative branches even when they're opposed to him, and his power is supposedly at his lowest ebb. Or even more dangerous on the merits, what I call statutory Curtis Wright. Curtis Wright not only had a constitutional theory of the president as the sole organ in foreign affairs, but asserted an extremely deferential canon of statutory construction, which interacts dangerously with courts that engage in simplistic textualism and reading of words. So it's going to come to a head, for example, in the Alien Enemies Act. Mm-hmm. The president is invoking the Alien Enemies Act, which was last used for the Japanese internment, saying there is an invasion or predatory incursion by Tren de Aragua, even though they're not of a nation state or government, which is specifically mentioned in the statute. And it cannot be that this statute should be construed to give this kind of power. Or 3 different cases recently brought, all saying that the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, which is designed to award sanctions, is not designed to give authority to provide imposts or excises, which is a power given to Congress by the Constitution. Or finally, I have to mention this because this is something that my students and I have been working on, the Bill of Attainder Clause. The Constitution says that there shall be no bills of attainder by the executive branch or the legislative branch, which is arbitrarily naming people for punishment. Now, when asked about this in the hearing about the Perkins Coie law firm, the government lawyer said, well, the Bill of Attainder Clause is in Article 1, namely the legislative clause, not Article 2, the President's Clause. Think what that means. If Congress and the President acting together cannot issue a bill of attainder, so the President plus 535 members of Congress, how on earth can the President issue the same order by himself? And that's essentially the power that he's asserting. And my students and I went back. We looked at the history of bills of attainder going back to the 1300s. In England, the king never granted a bill of attainder without parliamentary approval. And his thesis is that the founders of the Constitution, many of whom were subject to bill of attainder and arbitrary acts by the king, created a system where the President of the United States could exercise a power that no king of England had exercised for 300 years. Now, if you're a fan of original constitutional meaning, you better go back and look at that and figure out whether the president has the right to say that Harvard loses its tax exemption, that Perkins Coie gets thrown out of business because they hired certain people to work for them, and then just pick out various people for arbitrary punishment. This is exactly the kind of thing that our Constitution was meant to prevent. And we should go back to the original meaning to say that what he's doing is ultra vires. It's not just that it violates rights. He has no authority to do it.
And if you haven't read the appeals decision that Harold mentioned from yesterday, you should. Harold, you've spent a lot of your career, and I know many in the audience have spent a lot of their careers trying to use international institutions to hold governments account, be that the ICJ or others. And I guess I'm wondering, do you see any role that international institutions will play in judging the United States in the years ahead? Obviously, with the appellate body and the state it is in and our relatively limited acceptances of jurisdiction at the ICJ, it's not easy, but I'm just curious whether you see those institutions that we've relied on maybe now taking a different look at us.
Well, as you know, Bill, and it's part of the book you mentioned, my approach to all of this is something called transnational legal process. In domestic systems, we have a simple system of enforcement. Somebody commits a crime in D.C., they're arrested in D.C. by D.C. police, they're tried by a D.C. judge before a D.C. jury, and then they're sentenced to punishment in a D.C. jail. But the international system is one of complex enforcement, where you get the ruling of liability here, you pursue the assets there, the forms of enforcement are multiple. And the role of the lawyer in that situation is picking up the pieces of the enforcement process from different places. So when we won the provisional measures order in the Ukraine-Russia genocide case, I got a call from a reporter at the Washington Post, and he says to me, isn't this a meaningless order from the court because the ICJ has no enforcement power, can't enforce its own judgments? And I said, excuse me, no court anywhere in the world can enforce its own judgments, including the United States Supreme Court. It is the province and duty of the Judicial Department to say what the law is. And if they say the behavior is illegal, then everybody enforces it. That's the whole point. And that's the role these institutions can play, dispelling the claim that what's going on is not illegal, and then having the various enforcement mechanisms of international law kick in to provide the remedies.
So I am now going to start with some questions from the audience. And Harold, this one's come up several times. I'm going to paraphrase it, but personalize it, which is you've spent a lot of your career as a government lawyer, serving in 3 different administrations. And I guess the question is, 4 different administrations. And the question is, what is the role of government lawyers today? And when should government lawyers think about the hard choice of exit rather than staying?
Well, that's a very personal thing. I love being a government lawyer. I love the people who are lawyers in government service. There is an irony that I want to point out that became more and more apparent to me as I was writing my last book, the one that just came out, which is, you're a government lawyer. There's a national security threat. We have become accustomed to thinking that the role of lawyers is to give the president more freedom so he can deal with the national security threat. But what happens when you put together over generations, thousands of executive decisions, giving the president more freedom to deal with these threats, it does not envisioned the possibility that the president himself could be the biggest national security threat we have. And then we've created an unconstrained autocrat who claims a right to use law to trump, literally, all opposition. So under Trump's theory, he is creative in being the first president to assert that any challenge to his authority within the U.S. government is a violation of the unitary executive, and any threat coming from the outside is a violation of the separation of powers. And it's that theory, that totalizing theory, that allows him essentially to assert that he can nullify the rule of law for his own administration. But I think that lawyers have been, now that you recognize that lawyers help create the problem, lawyers also have to create the solution. We have to have the architecture of legal structures, statutes, treaties, and other things that constrain the president, see the constraint as a positive thing. You know, as I say at the Harvard graduation, those wise restraints that make us free.
So we've gotten several questions on issues related to deportation, and I'll read one of them. Considering that the federal government is now deporting persons in contravention of U.S. domestic law, what obligations does the international community have to try to prevent this, and what practical measures could allies and other countries take to address this issue?
Well, number one, the international community can enforce and through every method possible monitor violations of the Convention Against Torture, the Refugee Convention, etc. Does anybody here seriously believe that in Bukele's prison, CICOT in El Salvador, that people are not being subjected to cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or torture? And you're not supposed to deport people to those situations. Secondly, again, I want to go to the El Salvadorian situation, which grew out of this secret war in Central America when El Salvador first began to collaborate. And Bukele came along to assert a mass incarceration program, which he hoped to make viable by creating this prison that would take people from other countries, whether they were guilty or not. And in doing so, he was assisted by a network of private individuals, private airlines, money. It's the Iran-Contra affair. And the hope was to make this model economically viable by large payments from foreign governments. And that's the payment that's being made by the Trump administration to take these Venezuelans. And obviously, they came up with this plan during the transition because they started to execute it almost immediately. Now, as we learned, for example, when the CIA was using black sites, allies and others have to monitor this kind of activity. Mm-hmm. You know, the ICRC can ask to send their inspectors in. You know, it turns out that if a congressman like Chris Von Hollen of Maryland goes down there and gets enough press, they have to bring the guy out to meet him. They're starting to recognize that it's not working. The stonewalling approach is not working. And so we're starting to see the cracks. And the philosopher Mike Tyson put it best. He said, everybody's got a plan until they get punched in the face. So we've seen 89 days of Trump's plan. He's starting to get punched in the face. And he's very good at, when it becomes clear that this particular path is foreclosed, shifting gears, claiming victory, moving to something else, and accepting a symbolic outcome. And so the job, I think, of all those who are concerned about this is to close this door. You know, the president is not the extraterritorial warden-in-chief, and nobody gave him that power. And they say the courts have no jurisdiction. Well, they have jurisdiction over Trump and his entire government, which is here in Washington, D.C. And as you see, the judges are calling them in and saying, I'm not accepting that as an answer. I need to know every hour what you're doing to bring the guy back. And you're not going to get away with some sham where you claim to be facilitating, the El Salvadorans claim to be facilitating, and in fact, nobody's doing anything. And now we know that if somebody goes there, they'll bring the guy out. So if they'll bring him to Chris Van Hollen's hotel, they can bring him home.
So, Harold, in your 2018 book, you certainly imagine a world post-Trump one. And in fact, that world became a reality, and you went into the legal advisor's office and helped the United States begin to re-engage the world after the first Trump administration. Which takes me to the question, in 4 years, will we be able to recover in terms of our engagement with allies from the havoc being wreaked by this administration, and how will we accomplish that recovery? So what's going to be left, and how do we re-engage when that moment comes?
Well, I think earlier, Bill, you correctly sketched the different phases of this, which are resistance, resilience, revival, and reform. Revival means reviving the legal tools that we have to make it clear that this expansion of presidential authority is unconstitutional and trenching into other grounds. You know, the president doesn't have the power to take away Congress's power of the purse by doing the tariffs or by pausing expenditures that were made by Congress. The president doesn't have power to issue bills of attainder. The president doesn't have power, in my view, to just terminate all treaties at will. So all of these provisions that were written for a particular reason should be revived. Secondly, to resist. You know, the law firms and the universities who caved never learned the basic lesson of the schoolyard, which is if you cave to a bully, they come back and bully you some more. And so there's not really an alternative. You just have to stand up and fight back, say we're not going to do that, which is thankfully what Harvard is doing. Perkins Coie, Jenner and Block, Wilmer Hale, Sussman Godfrey, they're all doing that now. And the other law firms have to join them in doing that. Third, resilience, which is don't get worn down. You know, we're playing a kind of rope-a-dope strategy, which is what Muhammad Ali applied in Zaire, which is take the punishment, but let the other side punch itself out, and then waste their time on useless initiatives. And then as the support phrase, you know, the tariff policies are hurting Trump. The violations of civil liberties are hurting Trump. You know, fear of the measles is hurting Trump. And gradually, this is going to have a cumulative effect. But finally, at the end, it has to be a view that there's a need for a broader reform of the kind that occurred after Watergate and Vietnam, which was a reaffirmation of what I call the National Security Constitution. That's when the War Powers Resolution, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, Intelligence Oversight Act, the Export Control Act, all of these were passed during that period. And there has been no similar response. And you can't just say throw the rascals out because there are going to be other rascals. I hate to throw this in. You know, Trump is not the worst president we could imagine. You could imagine someone who's far more warlike, far more ready to commit troops, far more ready to send American soldiers to their deaths, and frankly, who's smarter and better organized and has the benefit of certain kinds of experience. And so the problem is structural. It's not just personalities. That's the theme of the book that I've just published.
And another related question, Harold, is how do we convince other countries and, quote, former allies to be allies once again when this era ends? How do we convince them that we're still going to be at the table when we've shown the possibility of two Trump terms and the foreign policy we're seeing?
Well, through institutions like the American Society of International Law. America is much bigger than its government. One thing that most countries recognize is most governments are much worse than the people in civil society that they represent. And we should maintain our commitments and just convince our allies that those commitments continue, whoever happens to be elected. Now, I'm sure it's shaken their confidence that having rid ourselves of Trump after one term
Here we are.
Here we are. And a lot of this is a failure to take certain kinds of obvious measures. We went and saw a journalist speak who mentioned that, on January 6th, the journalist got on an elevator at 2 o'clock in the morning where Mitch McConnell was coming down after Biden had been finally elected to the presidency by the electoral process. And he said that McConnell was jubilant, saying he's done, he's finished, Trump will never return. And the journalist said, well, does that mean that you will vote to impeach him for January 6th? To which McConnell replied, well, I don't know if that's necessary. And as you know, 10 senators did vote for conviction. McConnell did not, and his coalition did not. Trump was not convicted. That is why he was eligible to run again. And then by the time McConnell stepped down as leader, you see him doing things like objecting to the policy in Ukraine, protesting the return of polio and the possible returns of polio because of the confirmation of Robert F. Kennedy. So the time to stand up is to, it's not enough to say, this is what I want, and then actually do nothing to implement it.
Harold, we've gotten a series of questions about international institutions and the United Nations, and I'll try to clump them a little bit, but I'll read this one. Given that the Trump administration is cutting U.S. financial support for many international organizations, what is the impact of the weakening of those organizations? Might it present an opportunity to reevaluate and reshape them to become more effective? And relatedly, how do you see the U.S. relationship with the United Nations evolving, particularly as we now threaten to cut all funding, not just to the WHO, but also perhaps to the UN itself?
Well, I think the UN has obviously been impaired by the veto and if three of the permanent members, the United States, China, and Russia, are impeding a majority view on many kinds of things, they're going to turn to the General Assembly instead. I also think this is a time for frank self-evaluation. The other day in the panel we had, multilateral institutions have to prove their own worth by their achievements. And we can't just simply get up and say the ICC is great. The ICC has had a very mixed record of accomplishment, and we should hold them to a reasonable standard of performance. The World Health Organization played a useful role during the pandemic, but their effort to create a pandemic treaty on a ridiculously short timetable prevented them from doing the kinds of meaningful amendments that should have been done to the international health regulations. So, there are all kinds of different things that different international organizations should be doing based on what is possible to be achieved and making sure their reach doesn't exceed their grasp. And they have to win then support for what they're doing. Very few U.S. senators support the work of the International Criminal Court. Chris Dodd did because his father was a prosecutor, but we're that far away from Nuremberg. And the number of people who have seen a real benefit to international criminal justice are looking for an example. So, okay, Rodrigo Duterte is now in The Hague. That's a good case study. How are you going to handle that case? Is that going to achieve a meaningful result? Are they going to prosecute him for the right crimes? Will that case be well and expeditiously handled? What kind of message is it going to send? That's a test case for the ICC and Karim Khan right now.
Well, we're still on the UN and international organizations. Someone asks about the legitimacy of the UN Security Council when not just one or two, but perhaps three great powers there seem to have, as this person says, gone rogue, but at least don't seem to be following the basic rules of international law. Can the rest of the world still see the Security Council as able to ensure international peace and security?
Well, obviously the UN is badly in need of structural reform. Kofi Annan for the Millennium Project had a whole set of alterations and amendments to the UN Charter that were designed to address these issues and give better representation to the global South. But part of the problem has been that the World War II allies are not ready to release this power, which is making it very hard for the UN to achieve things, especially on the peace and security side. So one of the things that can happen, I think, is institutions evolve. One of my favorite articles is by Stephen Jay Gould, The Panda's Thumb, where he points out that pandas, who are not primates, they're marsupials, have actually developed a vestigial bone to do the thing that they need the most, which is stripping bamboo. And that you have these ad hoc evolutionary structures that develop to make institutions work better. One of them is the Secretary General of the United Nations. The Secretary General position was created as a ministerial position, and it wasn't until Dag Hammarskjöld that it became the public face. And so the executive branch of the UN stopped being as much the Security Council and became as much the leadership. And now the Secretariat is a huge organization. So these institutions, even against the constraints of formal amendment, can still evolve in certain ways. And the UN has actually done a very good job on that with regard to human rights, creating working groups, special rapporteurs, Assistant Secretary General for Atrocities Prevention, things like that.
Harold, I'm going to ask you a group of two questions together. Both relate to intelligence and technology sharing. One person from the audience says, from a national security perspective, our closest intelligence allies must be nervous about the nature of access being given to 20-something DOJ staffers. How do we maintain relationships when there's somewhat, these concerns are there? And a related question says, do you see the U.S. continuing to share its cutting-edge strategic technology with defense partners, or resorting to isolationism in an effort to maintain technological superiority? So where does all that we're seeing impact our intelligence and technology sharing in both directions?
Yeah, I was discussing this very question in a very classified Signal chat with a group of friends, including Jeffrey Goldberg. So that's part of the mystery of this, is that some things are ludicrously over-classified. And that confuses people from the question of what is genuinely classified and sensitive information, which is being shared among the Five Eyes and others. And one of the great innovations of the Ukraine war was that Avril Haines, a terrific international lawyer, who was head of the Director of National Intelligence, and Bill Burns, the CIA director, had intel making it clear that they knew that Putin intended to invade. And instead of holding this information back, they started sharing with the NATO allies ex ante, ahead of time, that the invasion was coming. And then as Jake Sullivan and others were meeting diplomatically, the allies started to realize that this is not just saber rattling, it's really going to happen. And that allowed them to mobilize for a very robust response, much more response than robust than had occurred in 2014 when the Russians insinuated themselves into Crimea. So I think, frankly, I think that the intel sharing arrangements are extremely beneficial to the United States. I don't know that they need to be fundamentally repaired. I do think that there's wild overclassification. And the allocation of intelligence information within the U.S. government is wildly skewed depending on the budgets of different agencies. I won't tell the whole story, but one night I was working at the highest level of classification, and at the very end of it, the person on the other side, who was at the White House, discussing very sensitive stuff, said, "By the way, I'm going to New Haven this weekend. Later on, I'm at home and I'm told to come in at 2 o'clock in the morning to receive this this super classified message. I get in, drive in, go there, all this stuff, go through this into this skiff, open this thing, put in a special computer, and it turned it on. The message was, for pizza, do you prefer Pepe's or Sally's? So, this is what happens when you have operating in an ecosystem in which there's wild overclassification. There's going to be leaks. There's going to be ludicrous things like the Signal Gate. There's going to be huge controversies about things like email, et cetera.
The clock up here is telling me we only have less than 5 minutes left, and I want to squeeze a couple questions in. As America steps back, China and Russia will invariably step forward. What does this mean for the future of the international legal order?
I would put them in a quite different category. Russia wants to regain lost empire, and they view NATO as a very serious threat, and the expansion of NATO as a very serious threat. Putin is not a strategic genius, but Putin is an international lawyer. Everybody should know that. He wrote his
Petersburg Law School.
St. Petersburg Law School. China is different. China has a very strong and consistent historical position taken over the years by the same group of people waiting for people in the United States who are so egotistical or ignorant that they don't understand that their strategy is working. I remember watching when Trump got off the airplane in Beijing and walked to shake hands with Xi Jinping. There were 5 Americanists of the Beijing side who were just there smiling. Here's a person who has no idea of the history of this strategic relationship, thinking that he's going to deal with us in a completely impulsive and ad hoc way. And, look at what happened. Trump says, I'm going to impose tariffs. And then next day, Xi Jinping, okay, 84% counter tariffs. And then Trump, well, maybe not. And so there's a certain kind of consistency. More than that, I think the Chinese have started to recognize that the American-built and supported institutions of the World Economic Order can be supplanted by alternative Chinese-led mechanisms, Chinese Asian Development Bank and Belt and Road Initiative and other kinds of things that they can, exert their influence in countries all over the world, as you know from our time in the State Department. And the United States is going to have to address that on the same global basis as the Chinese are pursuing that.
A last question with just 1 minute, Harold. There's a lot of people that want me to force you to make a prediction as to whether the Supreme Court is actually going to stand up to Trump in some of the cases you've just mentioned. Sorry to put you on the spot. I know you, no betting on this one, but.
I think it turns on John Roberts, and who was a year ahead of me in law school. John Roberts cares about the Roberts Court. Mm-hmm. And I think he has to be aware that this is a make or break moment for the Roberts Court. And if people like J. Harvey Wilkinson are saying what they're saying, it shouldn't be that difficult. For example, if you look at the Abrego Garcia case, I'm quite confident that the 9-0 vote to support facilitate rather than facilitate and effectuate. By the way, that was Wilkinson's position in the early part of the case. They 9-0 made that ruling. And then Trump quickly turned that into a transparent sham. And now they have to say, do you respect the order of the court or not? Now, Roberts, among other things, said, stop talking about impeaching judges. I think his moment of truth is arriving. And we'll see whether he's a legitimate leader or not. But let me close with something that's in the book itself, maybe on a more upbeat note. The comedian Mel Brooks had a routine about the 2,000-year-old man. And the 2,000-year-old man is supposedly recalling events from 2,000 years ago. And one of the things he's asked is, was there always a God? And he goes, no, before God, there was this guy named Phil. And who was Phil? He goes, well, we used to get down and bow down to Phil and say, don't beat us and don't hurt us and don't kick us and make our lives miserable. And then one day, lightning came out of the sky and struck him dead. And we said, there's something bigger than Phil. Well, there's something bigger than Trump. That's international law. That's the system of transnational and international legal process and rules and norms that we've created and that we've helped to sustain in this society over 119 years. And Trump does not own that. He cannot eliminate that. He can attack it. It's resilient and it's sticky, but it's not going to fight for itself. This is not a self-executing system. Every single member of this community has a duty to fight for it. There will be, over the course of many years, challenges to that system, and this is a particularly grave one. But again, my hope and expectation is that we will prevail.
Well, Harold, you have reminded the society that the 4 R's, revival, resilience, resistance, and reform, are in our hands. And for that, we are very grateful. But mostly, we're grateful for your wisdom and the career you have dedicated to the defense of international law. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Bill.